You know how many pricing tiers Apple offers when you walk into a store to buy an iPhone? Usually three: a basic model, a Pro model, and a Pro Max model. Same core product, same brand, same factory, but wildly different prices depending on which version you pick and which features you are willing to give up. Now, here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. That exact pricing structure, refined by Apple starting around 2016, is the same structure sitting underneath every ticket you buy on United, Delta, or American today. The airlines did not invent this, they copied it. And in doing so, they may have quietly saved themselves from an existential threat that low-cost carriers had been building for over a decade. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to a moment when the legacy airlines were genuinely losing. Not losing a little. Losing badly on the one metric that actually decides where people buy tickets: price. Throughout the 2000s and into the early 2010s, a wave of low-cost carriers, Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, and internationally Ryanair and EasyJet, built entire business models around one brutally simple idea: strip the airplane down to its bare mechanical function, a seat that moves from one city to another, and charge less for it than anyone thought possible. No free checked bags, no free seat selection, no free snacks, no frills of any kind. Just a seat and a seat belt, sold at a price that made legacy carriers look absurd by comparison. And it worked. Spirit Airlines, for example, grew from a tiny regional operator into one of the fastest expanding airlines in the country, specifically because it could publish a base fare that looked shockingly cheap next to Delta or American selling the same route. Passengers would see a headline price 2 to 3 times cheaper than the legacy carrier, and even after all the inevitable extra fees for bags and seats got added back on, plenty of travelers still came out ahead, or at least believed they did. Legacy airlines watched this happen for years and could not figure out how to respond. Their entire cost structure built around unionized labor, hub and spoke networks, aging fleets, and decades of legacy contracts made it functionally impossible to match Spirit's rock-bottom base fare and still turn a profit. If Delta tried to price match Spirit route by route, Delta would bleed money on every single seat. The legacy carriers were trapped. They could not out-cheap the discounters, but they also could not afford to keep losing price-sensitive travelers to them either. Meanwhile, on a completely different side of the economy, in Cupertino, California, Apple was solving a strikingly similar problem, just with a phone instead of a plane ticket. For years, Apple had sold the iPhone largely as a single-tier product, one main model per generation, with a handful of storage options to choose from. But by around 2016, Apple's engineers and executives faced a version of the same dilemma the airlines were facing. Some customers wanted the absolute latest, most advanced iPhone and were happy to pay a premium for it. Other customers just wanted a phone that worked, made calls, ran apps, and cost as little as possible. Trying to serve both of those customers with one single product and one single price point meant either overcharging the budget buyer or underpricing the premium buyer. And either way, Apple was leaving money on the table. Apple's solution became one of the most quietly influential pricing decisions in modern consumer technology. Instead of one iPhone, Apple built a deliberate 3-tier structure. A standard model that covered the basics at the lowest price point Apple was willing to offer. A Pro model with better cameras, better materials, and a noticeably higher price. And eventually a Pro Max model at the very top. The largest screen, the most advanced features, and the highest price of all. This is often described in pricing psychology circles as a good, better, best structure. And it is deceptively powerful. The genius of it is not really about the top tier or the bottom tier individually. It is about what having 3 tiers does to how customers perceive the middle option. When a shopper sees only one iPhone at one price, they either think it's worth it or they don't, and there's a real chance they walk away entirely if the price feels too high. But when that same shopper sees 3 iPhones side by side, cheap, medium, and expensive, something shifts psychologically. The cheap option starts to feel like it's missing something important. The expensive option starts to feel like overkill, for what most people actually need. And the middle option, the one Apple often wants you to buy anyway, suddenly looks like the obviously smart, balanced choice. Apple wasn't just selling phones anymore. Apple was selling a decision framework, and shoppers were making exactly the choice Apple had quietly nudged them toward. Retail analysts and business school case studies spent years afterward pointing to this exact structure as a masterclass in what's sometimes called tiered value segmentation, splitting one product line into deliberately differentiated versions so that customers self-select into the price point that matches their willingness to pay, rather than the company having to guess at a single universal price for everyone. And once other industries saw how effectively this worked for Apple, one of the most consistently profitable companies on the planet, it did not take long before other industries started asking whether the same structure could work for them. Which brings us back to the airlines, sitting there in the mid-2010s, watching their market share get eaten alive by carriers selling stripped-down seats at rock-bottom prices, with no obvious way to fight back on price alone. And then, somewhere around 2017, the legacy carriers arrived at a solution that borrowed, almost exactly, from the Apple playbook. If you cannot compete on price for the identical product, split your one product into multiple tiers and let the cheapest tier compete directly with the low-cost carriers, while your existing full-fare product stays right where it always was. That is precisely how Basic Economy was born. American Airlines rolled out its version first in early 2017, followed quickly by Delta and United doing essentially the same thing within the same year. On the surface, Basic Economy looked like a simple new fare class, but underneath it was a complete restructuring of how legacy airlines thought about pricing an airplane seat. Suddenly, instead of one economy fare, there were effectively 3 tiers on nearly every flight. Basic Economy at the bottom, stripped down, no seat selection, no changes, last to board, sometimes no overhead bin space at all. Standard Economy in the middle, with the normal flexibility travelers had always expected. And then Premium Economy or First Class sitting at the top, exactly the way it always had. Look closely at that structure and you will notice it maps almost perfectly onto Apple's good, better, best framework. Basic Economy plays the exact same role as the entry-level iPhone, deliberately stripped of conveniences so that it feels just uncomfortable enough to push a meaningful percentage of travelers up to the next tier. Standard Economy plays the role of the middle iPhone, the balanced, sensible choice that most travelers end up landing on once they see what they'd be giving up by choosing the cheapest option. And Premium Economy or First Class plays the role of the Pro Max model, sitting at the top for travelers who want the full experience and are willing to pay accordingly. Just like Apple wasn't really trying to sell everyone the entry-level iPhone, the airlines were not really trying to fill every seat with Basic Economy passengers. They were trying to make Basic Economy just appealing enough on price to lure travelers away from Spirit and Frontier, while making Standard Economy look, by comparison, like the obviously smarter choice once travelers actually priced out the restrictions. And it worked in a very specific, measurable way. Once Basic Economy existed, legacy airlines could finally publish a headline fare that looked competitive next to a discount carrier's advertised price. A traveler comparing Delta to Spirit for the same route no longer saw a jarring gap where Delta looked 2 or 3 times more expensive. Now Delta had its own rock bottom number to show, right there on the search results page, sitting close enough to Spirit's price that the psychological advantage discount carriers had relied on for years started to erode. But here's the part that made this such a shrewd business move rather than just a marketing trick. Most travelers who clicked on that cheap Basic Economy fare never actually intended to fly with zero flexibility, no seat assignment, and boarding dead last. Airlines discovered something remarkably consistent across their booking data. A large share of customers who started shopping in the Basic Economy tier ended up either upgrading during the booking process, once they saw what they'd be giving up, or simply choosing Standard Economy outright because the price difference suddenly felt small compared to the hassle being avoided. Basic Economy, in other words, was never really designed to be a popular purchase. It was designed to be the anchor that made everything above it look reasonable. Exactly the same function the base model iPhone plays for Apple. There's a concept in behavioral economics called the decoy effect, and it explains precisely why this works so reliably. When people are given two choices, a cheap option with real drawbacks and an expensive option without them, they often struggle to decide, because comparing across different dimensions, price against comfort, feels genuinely difficult. But introduce a third option specifically engineered to look worse in some obvious way, and suddenly the decision becomes easy. The decoy doesn't need to sell well on its own. It exists purely to make one of the other options look like the clear winner by comparison. Basic economy is, almost textbook perfectly, a decoy option. Its restrictions are not accidental cost-cutting measures. They are deliberately calibrated frustrations, just annoying enough to nudge a meaningful percentage of shoppers towards standard economy, without being so harsh that nobody ever buys it at all. Because remember, basic economy still needs to look competitive enough on price to draw customers away from Spirit and Frontier in the first place. The financial results validated the strategy almost immediately. Within a couple of years of rolling out basic economy, all three major legacy carriers reported that the fare class was successfully capturing price-sensitive travelers who previously would have booked with discount airlines entirely, while simultaneously protecting the profit margins on their core standard economy and premium products. Analysts covering the airline industry noted that basic economy allowed legacy carriers to compete on headline price without actually cannibalizing their higher margin fare classes, because so many travelers who started in the cheapest tier ended up trading up before completing their purchase. It was, in financial terms, close to the best of both worlds. A cheap, public-facing price to stop the bleeding of market share to discount carriers, and a pricing structure engineered to push most actual purchases toward the more profitable tiers sitting just above it. Meanwhile, the low-cost carriers found themselves in a genuinely difficult new position. Their entire competitive advantage had always rested on offering a fare so much cheaper than the legacy airlines that travelers would tolerate the lack of amenities in exchange for the savings. But once United, Delta, and American each had their own rock bottom, basic economy fare sitting right next to Spirit's advertised price on every flight search website, that price gap shrank dramatically. Spirit was no longer the only cheap option on the board. It was simply one of several cheap options, several of which happened to come attached to a much larger, more reliable airline network, with more frequent flights, more reward program benefits, and a brand most travelers already trusted more than a discount carrier they associated with cramped seats and surprise fees. The low-cost carrier's core value proposition, being dramatically cheaper than the big airlines, had quietly been narrowed down to being marginally cheaper than the big airlines, and marginal price advantages are a much harder thing to build an entire airline around. This dynamic played out in the financial performance of discount carriers in the years that followed. Spirit and Frontier both faced increasingly difficult competitive pressure throughout the late 2010s and into the following decade, struggling to maintain the growth trajectories that had defined their earlier years. Spirit Airlines, in particular, ran into serious financial distress, eventually filing for bankruptcy protection. A stark turnaround for a carrier that had once looked like the future of American air travel. It would be an oversimplification to say basic economy alone caused these struggles. Rising fuel costs, aircraft delivery delays, and broader economic pressures all played significant roles. But industry analysts consistently pointed to the erosion of the price gap between legacy carriers and discount carriers as one of the structural factors squeezing the low-cost model from a direction it had never really had to defend against before. For years, Spirit's entire pitch to customers had been built around a comparison that basic economy fundamentally altered. What makes this story genuinely remarkable is how directly the underlying logic transferred from one industry to a completely unrelated one. Apple was solving a consumer electronics pricing problem, trying to capture both budget-conscious buyers and premium buyers without cannibalizing its own margins in the process. Airlines were solving a completely different problem on paper, fending off a wave of no-frills competitors threatening their market share on price. But the solution to both problems turned out to be structurally identical. Take one product, split it deliberately into a tiered hierarchy of good, better, and best versions. Engineer the cheapest tier to be just uncomfortable enough that it functions primarily as a decoy rather than a genuine destination. And let customer psychology do the rest of the work, pushing people toward the middle tier where the real profit margins live. This pattern, once you notice it in airlines and smartphones, becomes strikingly visible almost everywhere else in the modern economy too. Streaming services now routinely offer a cheap ad-supported tier, a mid-range standard tier, and a premium ad-free tier, following essentially the same logic. Car manufacturers offer base trims stripped of amenities specifically to make mid-range trims look like an obviously better deal. Software companies price their basic plans deliberately light on features to nudge business customers toward the plan sitting one tier up. None of these industries copied each other directly in most cases. They arrived independently at the same conclusion because the underlying psychology of how people compare prices across multiple options is consistent across almost any market you can name. Apple didn't invent the good, better, best structure from nothing either. Versions of tiered pricing existed in retail long before the iPhone. But Apple's execution of it in the mid-2010s became so widely studied, so widely cited in business strategy circles, that it effectively became the modern reference point other industries pointed to when justifying their own version of the same structure internally. For the legacy airlines specifically, adopting this Apple-style tiering wasn't just a defensive move against Spirit and Frontier. It fundamentally changed how much control the airlines had over their own pricing narrative. Before basic economy existed, legacy carriers were essentially forced to react to whatever price discount carriers set, always looking expensive by comparison on the exact metric travelers cared about most when comparing options. After basic economy existed, legacy carriers got to set their own headline price, publish it proudly, and then rely on the tiered structure above it to quietly recover the margin elsewhere in the booking process. That shift from reactive pricing to proactive tiered pricing is arguably the single most important structural change legacy airlines made in response to a full decade of losing ground to discount carriers. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this connection really is. On the surface, there is nothing obviously in common between a company selling smartphones out of sleek retail stores and an airline selling seats on a Boeing jet. Different products, different customers, different regulatory environments, different everything. But strip away the surface details, and both industries were solving the exact same underlying math problem. How do you serve a customer base with wildly different price sensitivities using a single product line without either scaring away your budget-conscious customers or leaving money on the table with your premium customers? Apple solved it first at massive scale with enough public success that the strategy became impossible for other industries to ignore. The airlines, staring down an existential threat from low-cost carriers that traditional pricing approaches simply couldn't answer, borrowed that exact solution, renamed it Basic Economy, and used it to claw back the pricing narrative that discount carriers had controlled for the better part of a decade. None of this happened through some formal, announced partnership between Apple and the airline industry. There was no meeting where airline executives and Apple executives sat down together to share strategy documents. What happened instead is something that tends to occur across the broader economy more often than people realize. One industry solves a genuinely hard pricing problem in a highly visible, highly successful way, and other industries facing structurally similar problems eventually notice, adapt the framework to their own product, and quietly reshape their entire competitive position as a result. Apple wanted to sell more iPhones to more types of customers without undercutting its own margins. The airlines wanted to stop losing customers to Spirit without matching Spirit's prices on every single seat. Both industries landed on the same three-tier solution, and for the legacy airlines, that borrowed pricing structure turned out to be one of the more effective tools they had for slowing down, and in some cases outright reversing, the momentum that low-cost carriers had spent over a decade building.